Okay.
Do 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 science. Do 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 science. Do 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 science. Do 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 science. Do 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 science. Do 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 science. You're done?
Done. Hey guys, hope you're still doing well. Today we're going to be going over isolation mechanisms. This is your assignment for the 21st. I'm going to be going over a PowerPoint with you that will be shared, and then you also have an assignment just to show you. You'll be doing your isolation mechanism YouTube video with me today, and then you have your actual assignment due tomorrow. To show you what that looks like, this is the assignment that you'll be going over. There's 3 different types of isolation mechanisms. I'll be going over all of those, and you just have this sheet to fill out. Again, this is another PDF, so if you have to just type this out on a separate sheet, that's fine. You do not need to reword everything for me. If you just want to send me your answers, I'm good with that. So what this looks like from here, we're just going to leave this. Isolation mechanisms are a fancy way of saying that groups of a population have been separated and isolated from each other, meaning they have no contact with one another, and there's different ways that this can happen. And what is going to happen over time is if these groups stay isolated and not in contact with one another, they are going to form different species. And so this is speciation, which is, I believe, one of the terms in your assignment. So over time, what will happen is you're going to start to see different species occur. So I have this image here from Darwin's finches and his studies of that. And what he discovered was that because all of these birds were on separate islands, each island had its own resources of food available. And based on that, these birds over time developed different beak structures. So that's just one example. I'll show you several others in this. Our first type of isolation is reproductive isolation. And this is just when 2 organisms can no longer reproduce. And when I say they can no longer reproduce, I'm looking at their offspring and if their offspring are fertile or not. So sometimes organisms can still reproduce, but their offspring can't. And so that doesn't count. They have to have a viable offspring. And so each of these different types I'm going to go over would all be considered reproductive isolation. This is kind of your umbrella term here. Your first type is behavioral isolation, and this is when 2 species no longer interbreed because of the behaviors that they have. And so I'm going to show you 2 examples here, or one example here of 2 different birds, and they're going to look very similar, but their behaviors are so different that these 2 birds do not interbreed. They do not mate together. So there's a meadowlark, and there's the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark, and here they are. As you can see, they look very, very similar. However, the western meadowlark sings a very different song than the eastern meadowlark does, and the birds are attracted to these songs. And so based on the song, the western does not mate with the eastern and vice versa. And so over time, what this has done is it's allowed for these 2 different species to exist. We know they're 2 different species because if I took a western meadowlark and tried to breed it with an eastern meadowlark, they would either be unable to breed or their offspring would be sterile or not viable. That's one example. Again, they look very similar. They're in the same area, but based on behavior, so in this case it's a song, they do not interbreed. The next type of isolation that can occur is geographic isolation, and this is when 2 populations or more are separated by some geological barrier. So the example I'll be looking at here are different squirrels. The Colorado River separates a population of squirrels. Forgive me, I don't know exactly if I'm saying this correctly, but the kabob and Abert squirrel, you can see them both here. And they, again, look similar, but one is found on one side of the river and one is found on the other side of the river. And so they do not mate simply because they have that physical barrier. And again, we know these are 2 different species because on the off chance they were able to meet up, they do not make viable offspring. Another example, or your final example of different isolation mechanisms, is temporal isolation. This one might be the hardest to remember, but temporal has to do with time. And so what this is referring to is when 2 groups or more have different mating seasons, meaning there's a small window of time when these groups can breed, and if those time frames don't line up at the same season, then they can't breed together. So the example I have here are different orchid plants, and they have studied orchid plants in Brazil, and they have found that even though there are many, many, many different species growing in the same forests, they might have days or maybe even hours of time when they're available to breed. And so cross-pollination can't happen because that one species will only breed for such a brief amount of time that the other species doesn't pollinate during that time. And so that's how we have these different orchid species that stay true. They don't cross-pollinate because the other doesn't produce that pollen during that time. This can also happen in animals as well, but I just chose a plant here. So those are the different types. That should be enough information for you to work through this. Again, I'm just looking for definitions up here, and then you're reading each of these. So this first one I'll do for you. It says fireflies have a unique lighting pattern. Frequency of lighting varies and is species specific. Fireflies in the same area will not mate with those that have a different lighting frequency. So for the isolation mechanism, I want to know, is that temporal, behavioral, or geographic? And in this case, this would be behavioral. And the source of this is their lighting pattern. I know that that is the behavior. So that's what I want you guys to do for these. Make it specific for each scenario. And that should be that. So as always, if you have any questions, please be emailing me. I respond pretty quickly. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.
Do 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 science. Do 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 science. Do 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 science. Do 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 science. Do 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 science. Do 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 science.